Hello, everyone, and welcome back for the next edition of the Sports Pro StreamTime podcast. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead here at Sports Pro Media, joined as always by my CEO, Nick Meacham. Nick, how's it going? I've been awfully quiet this NFL season, but the Bengals are on a little bit of a roll, Nick. So, your worst nightmare. There may be more Bengals mentions in upcoming shows.
Hey, they're looking good. A good performance over the weekend. I got a little bit of a dose of the NFL again last night. So good to keep getting my fix regularly. But yeah, look, go the Bengals. I say if you're a happy Chris is a happy podcast host. So makes me look better if you're perky and not looking at me looking at me for answers or looking to tear me apart on the pod with less favorable comments. So go the Bengals, I say.
Yeah, well, not only that, Nick, I did a Twitter thread a little while back about So Rare, my experiences there.
Mm.
And for my second time now in 6 weeks, I've won another award. This one is not worth as much as the first one. The first one I ended up selling that player on for about 150 pounds. This one, not quite as valuable, but I'm telling you, sort of that dopamine that's sort of released, all those happiness when you win it. Yeah, it's going good. And, I sent you a message that, they've done their NBA stuff. LeBron James's card selling for like 80 grand. And, that's a podcast we did with Ryan Spoon. It's So Rare, who's actually, I think, got a new position now since we've done that. But yeah, I had to mention it's been a pretty good week for me in terms of sports, of fantasy stuff, some of it's relevant to the Web3 space and all we've talked about. So yeah, Nick, a happy Chris for this day's podcast.
Good stuff. I mean, the So Rare business, we obviously have done a podcast with Ryan Spoon, who was COO at the time and is shifting into an advisory role. I still hear people calling them Sorare, which is quite funny. It reminds me of the years of DAZN getting called Dazn by a lot of people. So hopefully the industry will eventually catch up with their name. I have to admit, I was one of them who was also calling it Sorare until someone said, I'm like, oh my God, how obvious is that, considering it's all about collectibles? So it makes a lot of sense when you get that explained to you. But a really interesting business. They recently announced their NBA deal, which is the one obviously you've been digging your teeth into of late, and probably one of the most interesting businesses in that space. So if you want to know more about SoWare and you want to know more about digital collectibles and I guess what sports and the Web3 play can play a role in, and it's something that has gone mainstream, which I think is really important. Mainstream to the point that even Chris is leading the way in terms of as a user. Go check out the podcast we did a few months back. There, it's really worth a listen.
Yeah, and speaking of former podcasts, not to go too down or too far down memory lane, but we talked about 2 weeks ago in one of our episodes about the World Rugby deal and Rugby Pass deal, and Ben Slack, who's the general manager commercial there. Um, at the time, Nick, you compared it to the FIVB deal, or sorry, I guess structure with Volleyball World as well, and he said yes, that's basically spot on, exactly what they're trying to do. So it's always nice when we hear from people to say, hey, your analysis is spot on. So, I'm glad people are enjoying the podcast. Speaking to Ben, he's in Australia, so it's a little bit more difficult. But I think the other thing we probably have to mention, Nick, is the OTT Summit is coming up in just about a month's time. We've mentioned it a few times. If anyone's going to be out of Madrid, please do let us know. We would love to set up some sort of stream time drink, stream time breakfast, something like that. So if you're going to be out there, just hit us up on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever it is. But definitely do let us know. We'd love to see as many of you guys out there as possible. And you can either tell us what we've gotten right or what we've gotten wrong so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us what you like. What sort of drink is your favorite drink of choice, and we'll make sure it's served at the bar for you when you guys join us. But no, it should be a great event out there. It's going to be our biggest event ever out there, I think. For all the numbers are over record. I think we'll probably be close to 1,000 plus for that event, which would be pretty massive and probably be the market, the global leader in OTT space. Well, it already was, but even more unquestioned than previously. So very much looking forward to that. So let's dig into it, Chris.
Absolutely. Well, we kind of started the show off with my standard NFL introduction, which is always based on whether or not the Bengals do well. But on the other hand, we'd previously talked about the launch of NFL Plus. Now, for those of you that maybe missed that bit of news when we covered that in the podcast, is essentially there used to be a deal with Verizon that covered streaming for out of market games specifically on mobile devices. And at the time, that was a free to access so long as you were kind of part of the Verizon family and things like that. That deal expired and no one kind of stepped in to fill that. So NFL Plus launched, and there's kind of two packages. One's at $4.99 per month, and then one's at $9.99 per month, and that sort of gives you different access to being able to replay games, commentary, things like that. But essentially, it was the NFL trying to further expand their sort of their D2C offering and step into this space. But so far, it's not quite been smooth sailing. There's been numerous complaints. There's been some technical issues. There's been questions raised whether or not there's enough content there to actually justify that subscription cost. And now there's sort of questions around why is it even being cost to stream if it was previously free. So, as much as we talk about this, we keep trying to remind people streaming is not easy, Nick, and even for someone like the NFL, they're kind of running into this. So what do you think about this now that NFL Plus, even though it launched in July, it's really here for the season, and we're kind of 7 weeks in, and not quite maybe what they were expecting, or is this realistic for what we should have seen coming?
Yeah, I mean, look at the scale of what the NFL has to work with. The NFL Network is one of the most successful sort of organizations, or the NFL media arm of the NFL is one of the most successful uh, setups that you could look at from a rights holder perspective that exists, right? And they've done a great job with building the network itself, and this sort of owned and operated platform sitting alongside their Game Pass product. Um, it was very interesting to see how it would progress and how it would work out for consumers and audiences. I still think what they're offering is as value is pretty significant. It's not just around the live match, although that is one of the major rights that have been ingested into this. But it's interesting that the Game Pass product. God, I can't say Game Pass. How hard is that? Anyway, um, it's the Game Pass international aspect, at least, is run by Delta Tray, but this product is run in house. So it's just interesting that they've decided to do it all themselves, and it gets you thinking a little bit about what we've talked about recently with regards to what the NBA has done about creating a single home for the NFL, or in that case, the NBA. Is this the first step? They wanted to get their toes into the water first to see if they could make it work, and then take it the next step, potentially in and ingesting it all into that platform. That's what I think they might have been considering with this move. They obviously didn't get a deal done with Verizon, and I'm sure there was other people in play, but it was a quite a unique set of rights to begin with. So look, it's something to be watching. That again, it's another example of that. The streaming side of things, if you want to do it yourself as a sports property, is really difficult, especially when you're dealing with the scale side of things. Also worth noting that the NFL media side and division is effectively, quote unquote, up for sale. So whatever that means. So it might be that one of the reasons they want to launch that is to build out the assets that they do have in that mix. But let's wait and see whether or not this, the NFL Plus initiative is a step in towards centralizing even more content and providing more value, or it's just a stopgap measure until they get someone else who's going to kick the tires and look at bringing some of those rights into their own platforms.
Well, this is where I'm going to ask you to just be totally speculative here. I recently spoke with
We're
someone
good
at
at speculation.
of course. I recently spoke to someone at the NFL media, and they said, they're already on to plans for 2024 with NFL Plus in terms of what they want to do, testing, trialing, different things. How much of this do you think they're actually hoping that someone like Apple comes in and ingests this entire thing into maybe what the Sunday NFL ticket is, or is this something that's genuinely they want to keep for themselves the
Hmm.
way NBA is? What are your thoughts on this?
Hmm. That's a good speculation there, Chris. I kind of like it. I mean, look, it would sync up pretty well as a set of rights alongside the Sunday ticket. So I'm not an expert around the NFL rights, but we've been talking about a lot about the NFL Sunday ticket as potentially a product or proposition that Apple is after. So this could very well be a stopgap until that deal's done, and hopefully then you would see those rights sort of brought together as sort of one major offering for Apple to get their hands onto. That would make a lot of sense. So I really like that.
Right.
I'm curious why I haven't heard more people say that, but maybe because you've got your fingers on the pulse better than most.
Maybe. Well, I think the other interesting bit about it is the Sunday, basically the NFL Sunday ticket rights. They're the last NFL rights that aren't locked up long term. So I think that's
Mm.
certainly when you start talking about supply and demand. Supply is currently very short, and I'm sure demand is always with the NFL is very high. So be interesting to see if people try to loop those rights in together, given this would previously been with Verizon, if they'd be open to opening that back up to the market. But either way, it's going to be a very interesting time for what happens with those rights with the NFL, particularly around the NFL Sunday Ticket as well. Okay, and we'll move it directly into the NBA. So interestingly, we kind of went from, you mentioned in your last answer, the NBA's gone now and developed their own app, and they've launched that to have their own sort of D2C platform in looking into the streaming world. Well, one of the things that's happened, and actually, Nick, we can put this as a big check mark to say we got it right, or I think we can say we got it right. One of your big bold predictions at the OTT USA Summit was that a team in a professional league would have a streaming deal within the next 12 months. And one of the pieces of news we're going to talk about is the LA Clippers with their Clipper Vision. They will essentially become the first NBA franchise to offer a D2C streaming platform with live in market games courtesy of Clipper Vision. It's going to broadcast 74 of 82 games this year. They're marketing the fact that they're working with AWS to have different features, such as their court vision or their mascot mode, gives you different animations, graphics, real time statistics to just try to change that experience for you, give you a more engaging watching experience. The platform costs $199 per year. That also gives you access to Bally Sports. And we've kind of talked about how teams might end up getting engaged with these RSNs. But also, the important part of this Clipper Vision is accessible directly through the NBA's new app. So even though it's Clipper Vision, you still have to go through the NBA's new app, new platform to kind of access it. So it's a lot of stuff there, Nick. Like I said, I think you can start by maybe just saying you're a bit proud, beating your chest, saying we got this big bold prediction right.
I'm glad you could remember that bold prediction because it's been a long time between events, but that was in what, March or so. But yeah, so what I understand of the deal is the deals were up, the RSN deal, so the local market, right? So for those that don't know the difference in the US, you have rights that are for your local market and then ones that are out of market. So these ones are the local market rights, and they were sitting with a legacy regional sports network. I think it was maybe the Bally Sports ones. I can't remember. But the long story short of is the Clippers have come out and said this was the plan all along. Steve Ballmer, who is the owner and who is ex Microsoft, I think he must have been one of the top few majority shareholders. So is a billions of billionaire, and this was allegedly their plan all along, was to try and do something like this. Now, what is quite interesting about it is that the games are sitting within the NBA centralized app. I would have thought they would want to do this in their own true D2C way and have it all in their own sort of Clipper home. Now I asked a few people why wouldn't they do that. A couple of reasons were shared were, all the infrastructure is there within the NBA app to serve this. So the NBA app is built for basically this extension to be available. So okay, fine. Versus that means that you don't have to manage it as a team or an operator. You can lean on the NBA's infrastructure to manage it all, which is probably a very significant investment if you wanted to do that. And also you can reduce the friction, or I guess attract people who are already subscribing to the NBA app to be able to push them into the Clippers sort of various channels. So I just thought that was an interesting play on this, that when I was thinking direct to consumer, I was always expecting them to kind of do it themselves in silo, but here they've really lent into using the NBA's tech stack and processes to leverage that sort of opportunity. For what it's worth, I really did wish that they called it Ballmer Vision, not Clipper Vision, just because if anyone sees Steve Ballmer on YouTube, just go up Steve Ballmer going crazy and read and watch some of the videos on YouTube. He is a nutcase in the best kind of way. So I would just like watching him for like 2 hours on his reactions to every single basket in a match. But look, they've landed. You've gone through some of the details there. It's quite exciting to see this step. It's not that big a deal, I don't think, in terms of the grand scheme of it, because it is sort of just sitting into the NBA's home. And I'll be really interested to see how successful that is and how heavily the Clippers take it on themselves to market that product and how much the NBA markets that product. But it is a significant moment because all of the content will be available through streaming channels first. And obviously we have heard a lot of noise about the RSNs world and through Sinclair being up for sale or being inquired by the major leagues in the MLB. I think it was the MLB the NHL, and the NBA were inquiring about acquiring some of those regional sports networks, right? So it's not over, but it's probably a step of, I think, expect more of this to come in the near future.
Modest as always, Nick, not wanting to take too much credit for your bold predictions, regardless of how we got to the end. We were still there. We're gonna take it.
Yeah, yeah, I should take it, but look, I mean, it's it looks very exciting. The breadth and depth. I heard some examples of how they're going to use data. The AWS relationship you mentioned. They're big on real time statistics. Second Spectrum data, who is a partner, I think, of the Clippers, will be involved, and they're also part of the NBA. And you'll be seeing things like real time data on the percentage chance of a player being able to score in real time as they've got the ball, and that score changing as they're getting closer to the hoop, or that make a move, etc. Like some pretty cool stuff that you'll be able to see in there that you wouldn't normally get in the linear broadcast. So it's that another sort of example of streaming being able to provide a different experience to the linear one that will you can still be leaned back, but you'll be able to see something different that you wouldn't normally get through the linear broadcast, which is quite cool.
It's another can of worms we're not going to talk about today, Nick. But one of the things that was interesting about AWS, I had the opportunity to interview um, Anish Madarni at the IOC. He's their head of digital partnerships and innovation. We had a session at last week's OTT series, which you can go find online if you really want to go watch it. I had several people reach out say they enjoyed the session, so I'll go ahead and shamelessly plug it. But one of the questions I did ask Anish, particularly when it comes to AI, um, is AI actually good in predictive analytics? If you're told your team has a 1% chance of winning, will you stay into tune and to follow it up, or will you
Mm.
actually turn people away? That's another conversation for another day. But I've read some articles recently saying predictive stats are actually a negative for sports. But maybe that's a question we'll ask somebody else or dive into it another time.
I was listening to it's an interesting question. I was listening to the Sportico guys doing a podcast recently, and they actually mentioned the Clipper Vision stuff, and they were involved with a beta test, and I think they said that every single player had those sort of stats available to them on the screen at the same time. So there was just stats all over the screen, all over the place, happening all, and it was too much.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is a flip side to data that can be
Yeah.
telling you too much and therefore not giving you the sort of just the authentic experience that sports is supposed to provide. So there's always a balancing act with that stuff, I'm sure.
For sure. Well, moving on, one of our favorite topics, because every time we mention it, our engagements just go through the roof, and that's Fubo TV. It's every Wall Street bros favorite stock, apparently, that's also a fan of sports. And every time we talk about it, something goes off. We get lots of engagements. And there was some news. They came out with their quarter or third quarter report on just different numbers. And there was some stuff that was positive in terms of, 30% year on year growth. They're up to $210 million in terms of paid subscribers, exceeding 1.2 million, which is an increase of 27% according to their data and statistics. But some other sides of that as well is one of the big things that they talked about growth was going to be getting into the betting industry. And as part of this report, it's also basically effective as of now. Both Fubo Gaming and Fubo Sportsbook are going to be shut down now. David Gandler, the CEO there, mentioned that this is because of the challenging macroeconomic environment and their ability to impact reaching their long-term profitability goals. That's why they're making this decision. But Nick, I think you've talked about before. Betting is going to be a tricky one. It's not necessarily going to be the thing everyone thinks it is, but you're probably more closely following Fubo given all your Twitter threads. What do you make of their Q3 reports, and what do you think maybe more specifically around the gaming and the sportsbook closing?
Yeah, so there's plenty in this one. So I'll try and focus on the sort of key aspects. There's a separate conversation about Fubo's progress and their objectives. They've shifted a lot over the last 12 months. There's a lot to like about what they're doing, but the cash side of things is a problem. It was about growth, 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 and the whole industry was about growth, growth, growth. Now they've had to shift their narrative and focus to let's get profitable. And that's a very different business strategy, as we know, across the industry, right? So they've had to shift because the market hasn't looked at them favorably over the last sort of 12 months. Actually, go spend some time on Reddit and read the Fubo chats. You can actually see, if you follow them, just like the change in mood on there from the people that have been bought into them at different stages and along the way. And some of them aren't so bought in. But look, I would say it's much more of a pragmatic approach to how they're tackling things. Now, let's talk about betting and gaming specifically. they made a big song and dance about it, as the whole industry has. But there's been some real challenges for anyone looking at launching a betting proposition in the US, and that is you have to do it market by market, right? So state by state. So therefore, you to get the scale that you're sort of hoping for, well, no one's at the scale yet because it's a progressive, it's a work in progress, right? So so they've been rolling out, I think, the best part of 12 months or so now, if I remember correctly. Um, and look, it's hard to roll out betting. You know, to running a betting organization, you look at the types that exist in the market. There's not thousands of them that are truly the legitimate players. There's only a sort of a smaller amount. But I actually looked into, so I did some digging, and one of the first markets they launched in was in Iowa. Now, I looked at Iowa, population of 3.15 million. Is that right, Chris?
I mean,
Sound right to you?
it's a very big state, so I'm sure you can very easily disperse 3.1 million people across it.
Fair enough. Okay, so good. I'm just double checking that because I did a quick Google search on that. And so, look, that was one of the first markets they did launch in. And now, over the course of that time, through the financials I could find online, so through the Gaming Commission, they generated about $2.155 million in handles. So that is turnover, effectively. Of that, they paid out 1.986 back to consumers, which leaves them with a grand total of $170,000 or a 7% net margin. So look, positive there is that was profitable. Over 12 months, 2 million isn't the worst result, but it's a lot of work to generate 100 grand. Yeah, because that doesn't tell you is all the investment and the cost of actually operating that sports book. All that is literally receipts versus net results there. So if you, but I did it for fun. I extrapolated that to what would happen if they were in every single market. So in every single market across the US. So basically 100 times that 3.15 million population, and you got to about 215 million turnover. But at a margin of 7%, you're looking at 16.9 million profit. So not a bad number when you're trying to be profitable. And it sounds lovely, doesn't it? But you have to get up and running in every state for starters. And for what I understand, that comes with insane costs. You're talking millions and millions and millions. So they could be working their backsides off in the next few years, and the reality is they would never even get up to that sort of scale. And you think about this generally, just taking a step back from those numbers in Iowa. So there's just a bit of fun and games to look at. Okay, that's where it could have been if you're spread across the US in one hit. The reality is, people watching TV, there's only a small percentage that wants to watch. There's only a percentage that wants to watch sports, and there's only a percentage of sports fans that would actually want to consider betting, and there's only a percentage of those fans that want to bet on their TVs and not through their existing preferred betting supplier or provider, right? So there's a lot of percentages cutting down then if you think you filter the way through. And I thought those numbers actually weren't as bad as I was expecting. But my point is, betting just generally is going to be a really difficult thing to make it work for anyone in this type of model, in this model where we're going to do it ourselves because it comes with such insane costs that are associated with it, with marginal gain. So the reality is, for anyone who is looking at doing this, my recommendation from the limited knowledge I have around this space, but what I'd be saying is, look for partners. Like that's the model that ESPN are looking for, right? They're not looking to do it themselves. They're looking for a partner to partner up with, and that can get value from the marketing value of being involved with your organization, as well as the potential returns on customers and customer acquisition, because that's when they can run it as a bit of a loss leader. Like that's what you're seeing DraftKings and FanDuel all investing heavily in partnering up with some of those major organizations, because they can even take a loss on some of that deal because of the marketing returns they're going to get on top of the customer acquisition and the brand building. So look, tough road betting. Obviously DAZN's another one which we will talk about a little bit here and no doubt in the future, but no surprise in the end that it hasn't worked. It's just insane that they had to put so much effort and time and noise around it, and then with only a matter of less than 12 months they've shut the whole proposition down.
Yeah, well, I guess better to accept your losses and just move on with it than fight a losing battle. Maybe that's easy to say when it's not my money that I'm losing out on, but at least they recognize that and they're not letting pride get in the way.
Well, yeah, but the problem is they can't because they are in a tough situation with their cash, and for them to keep growing their betting business, they would have to throw a lot more cash in it to grow market by market. You literally have to put up in some markets up front, cold hard cash just to get a license, right? So just the prospect of them actually growing to those scales that I talked about is actually unachievable. So for them to get to that profitable state, which is what they're laser focused on now, as they people like to say, the only way they can do that is just cut their losses and focused on doubling down on the areas that they can lead to more profitability, and that's going to be around their bread and butter business mainly.
Well, talking about throwing cash around, FIFA is upset that people aren't doing enough of that. This kind of broke, I think, on Friday. I think I originally saw a story posted from our good friend Dan Cohen at Octagon, and then I saw a couple other stories about it get popped around just on LinkedIn. Nick just scrolling through, and clearly FIFA must be a client or someone working with them. But basically, their chief business officer came out and said, pretty much they've turned down multiple offers from networks across Europe that includes the UK, Italy, Germany, France, and he's expecting a similar turn down in Spain for undervaluing the Women's World Cup. Essentially, he's saying this isn't a matter of being priced out, but rather a testament to the lack of willingness of broadcasters to pay what the women's game deserves. I believe he threw a statistic out there saying, generally speaking, uh, broadcasters pay roughly 2% of what they pay for the men's game in terms of having those rights. Don't know how accurate those stats are, but that's what he's throwing out there. But essentially, Nick, we're always talking about trying to get money and or not, I don't want to say get money, but they're always talking about this pie and how do you get as much of it. It's tight. Most of that money's now going to the premium rights, but FIFA's basically doubling down saying you're not paying enough for this given the numbers that we're seeing. Now, one of the interesting things is this World Cup's in Australia and New Zealand. So part of it is there's going to be a struggle watching that game in prime time. But what do you think, Nick? Is this a new move by FIFA? Is this something that other organizations have done in the past? How much of the time difference you think is an issue, and where do you think maybe we'll end up on this? Because we're not that far away from this Women's World Cup taking place.
No, it's really close actually. It's not far away at all, and it's surprising that we're still at this point where they're trying to work out their broadcast partners. But on the flip side, for FIFA, leaving it later has created such incredible momentum behind women's football that I think it will lead to a really good deal getting done. And deals getting done, even though this is what they're saying out in public. This is pretty commonplace and practice for rights owners to, at certain scales, to start negotiating in public a little bit and saying you need to put up more cash on the table, and maybe creating some bit of, what would you call it, like community support to push people over the edge to maybe get the deal done. I think the time zone thing is a massive problem. In terms of their key markets, this will not serve them at the times that they would normally be looking for from traditional European and American time slots. So that does not help them get the values that they would want. And it is interesting to see them get into those sorts of details in sort of public. But I think they'll get the deal done ultimately. There's too much momentum um, behind women's football right now that broadcasters will be posturing. They will be looking to pay as little as possible for those rights, as they do almost every single time. But then in the end, they will be picked up, no doubt, by someone that will use them effectively. But yeah, not an uncommon practice. I think ultimately, in terms of the ratio, and that's one of the challenges we have in this industry, is to make sure that the ratio of investment relative to return is at least on par, right? We know that the audiences for the men's versus women's might not be the same yet, but at least sort of the ratio and the ROI that, say, broadcasters might be paying should be either on par or even higher in the women's, because it's got the growth behind it and the momentum behind it. So if it is true that they're offering, broadcasters offering far under that rate, that would be surprising and disappointing. But I don't think that's where they'll get to. I think they'll get to a number, and they'll get the exposure that everyone is hopefully hoping for, and leverage this content as well as possible.
Yeah, public sentiment is certainly powerful. And as you say, it's just been a pretty phenomenal year when you think about some of the different women's sporting events. Obviously, the women's Euros was great. I know the NCAA women's basketball tournament smashed record numbers. So I'm sure, and I agree with you, Nick, they will find a way to make a deal get done that they're satisfied with and gets them a little bit closer to what those numbers should be in terms of splitting it up between the men's and women's game. Moving along here, we talked very briefly about Apple, and that seems like they're just involved in all kinds of rumors these days. But the ATP tour and the WTA tour, their coverage in Europe is going to look a little bit different here in the near future. Currently, those are found on Amazon, although Nick, you would argue discoverability of those on Amazon's actually not that clear cut. But that current deal is going to end at the end of 2023, and that's going to be picked up by Sky. And pretty much what it sounds like is how that happened was Sky managed to outbid Amazon for the US Open, and pretty much that kind of put Amazon off the idea of picking up the rest of those rights. So it's still expected that Sky and Warner Brothers Discovery owned Eurosport will likely be prominent bidders now that Amazon is going to step out of that. But there's also rumors that Apple TV is going to look to step in to get some of these rights because at the moment, their Apple TV is not very prominent within the UK. I think I read a statistic. There's only 1.3 million subscribers to Apple TV. I'm one of them, mostly because Ted Lasso is such a great TV show as compared to Amazon, which has a significantly higher reach. So for them, this is a play to hopefully perhaps get some more people onto their Apple TV Plus platform. But Nick, what do you think about this? Maybe we can talk about from an Amazon perspective that once again that they seem to be losing out on some rights that they've had before. Would you rather spin it to talk about, Eurosport or Sky, or do we want to take on more of these Apple rumors?
Yeah, I always wonder when you hear these stories hitting the airwaves, how they got to be on the airwaves, whether it's been released by the rights owner. I no doubt it's great reporting most of the time, but just it's interesting to hear how these stories might get out because again, negotiating in public doesn't hurt, and creating some buzz around the fact that Apple might be interested in your rights can only help, position yourselves in a certain place and space, right? Um, but anyway, that's massive speculation. We don't know how that's come to be. The notion of Apple going in for these rights, it's quite possible. But it would depend on the rest of their plan. I can't see them doing this deal without a much bigger plan in place or a play in place in terms of a bigger set of rights to go after. Like you said, that they haven't got market penetration, and bringing in tennis rights aren't going to create market penetration to the level that Apple would be wanting. It could be that they see this as a first step. So, for example, Apple did the MLB deal and then followed up with the MLS deal not far after that. Although so they might have another couple of deals in the works, and that just one piece of the bigger puzzle. But your point around discoverability, I've mentioned it before. I'm not a fan of Amazon's discoverability. I'm not a fan of what Amazon brings to the table with in terms of additional marketing and exposure and shoulder content. That's where someone like Sky does an incredible job. Where we talked about F1 as an example of that last week. I think Discovery does a pretty good job with that, particularly through its Eurosport channel and what they do. For tennis in particular, they've got history there. So I'd be surprised if Apple were to make this move unless they had a much bigger plan and they needed breadth of rights, because obviously there's a lot of tennis on all the time. So at least you can then make sure you've got a strong array of programming if that's one piece of the cocktail. But I can't see it being all in isolation. So we'll have to wait and see. But it's exciting to hear that Apple might be a legitimate bidder for rights in over this market. But just whether or not this is the one it's going to be the game changer, I'll wait and see. It's also just very interesting that ATP and WTA would consider this. I do wonder what their experience was like with Amazon. I haven't spoken to them personally, but I do know Amazon do like to keep their cards very close to their chest in terms of data. So hard for someone who's working with Amazon to get a real sense of audience consumption, how you're performing, what people are interested in. I don't know if they've warmed up to that recently, but that was a challenge I've heard from various parties. So this feels like we've hit a bit of a shift, I suppose, in inertia where working with Amazon isn't necessarily the home run move. It was nice to have them in the mix now, but they're now just one of these other big tech companies, and they have to still pay a premium because they're they don't bring something else to the table, and that is that real shoulder content, marketing support that others can do, like Sky and Discovery and alike.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to say. It felt like when I joined Sports Pro a little over 3 years ago that Amazon was the name everyone just threw in. Oh, Amazon's interested. Oh, there's rumors about Amazon. Like they were just the name that you kind of threw in there. But, they've had a bit of a run now with the Premier League, NFL, things like that. It almost feels like it's the opposite now where Apple is just the name you want to throw into everything, whether or not they're actually interested in it or not. It's just they're kind of now the hot name that everyone wants to use as that bargaining chip. So it is kind of funny, and I'm sure in a couple years time it'll probably be Google, it'll be someone else in that big data space, big tech space, but it's almost like they're just kind of the hot topic now that everybody wants to say that they're associated with.
Well, yeah. Look, I mean, I agree, and I would say it's clear that they're not done yet in this space. The MLS deals are a pretty big sign of that, and they could sit on that for a bit and see how it goes, to see if it has the impact they want it to. But I can't see they're being done yet, and as a result, these types of deals and these rumors are going to continue to cause headlines until we see what those moves are and will be, because they're no doubt only just at the beginning of their moves into the wider media landscape. You think about Apple TV Plus, they haven't really made that many moves. Although I did see they're launching Shantaram, a series which I read that book a couple of times, and it's a bloody good read. So, yeah, building out their portfolio, but still only scratching the surface of what they need to be if they want to be seen as a true global player in this space. And I can't imagine Apple do anything like this unless they're going to be a global player in this space.
Yeah, well, speaking, just the segues just coming in now, Nick. The last two going to keep on. Speaking of people that want to be global players, DAZN. This is one of those
Yes.
things that they've always wanted to be a global player. They've always tried to talk about themselves as that future of, the sports Netflix type at a global scale. So far, it's not necessarily gone that way all the time, but they do have a new deal with the PFL, which is the Professional Fighters League. They're actually going to launch a PFL Europe, which is going to have all their fights, all their events hosted within Europe, which will definitely help from a time zone perspective that we were talking about, Nick. Because I know at least with UFC, I'm not staying up till 6 a.m. to watch that. So at least this
Mm.
competition will benefit from that. But DAZN is going to be the exclusive partner for the PFL and their European launch, which is going to include 53 markets. To be honest, Nick, I didn't even realize there were 53 markets in Europe, but that's what the press release says. So there you go. Um, and that includes the likes of UK, Ireland,
Mm.
Spain. And they'll also be able to distribute some of the Super Fight Division pay per view on the outside of North America. So it's got a bit of an extensive way there, including from a subscription model as well as a pay per view model. But Nick, you posted some thoughts about the zone. Our technology editor Steve McCaskill had the opportunity to recently interview the CEO, and there's a couple things there. What do you think about this PFL Europe deal, or maybe some of the broader comments that were made from their CEO?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see. You're starting to see. I think you will see more of these deals where there's more in it than just a media rights transaction. We've heard a bit about this before. There's the A League and the Paramount deal, which we've covered before on the pod as well. When we had I think it was the CCO of Paramount on the podcast. But talking about that deal, they took a bit of an equity stake in that league as part of that arrangement and relationship. And that is the line here is that DAZN has taken a minor equity stake in that European, at least the European arm of the PFL, which has been positioned. I think the chief exec described it as the Champions League of the MMA, which will remain to be seen if that is actually where it gets to. But that's a pretty high bar if they're aiming for it. So you have to, I guess, appreciate and like this is what DAZN's role really can and should be. They're in a bunch of markets. They've got immediate reach. They're global. So they're great for, say, let's say a challenger sports property to go, hey, we need scale pretty quickly here. What can you do to help us achieve that? So there may not be a big, massive media rights check on the table in all instances, but they can bring a lot of things to the table that helps working with one partner, right? Rather than trying to do lots of different deals. And if you're a challenger sport, that can be quite difficult to do market by market. It takes a lot of resource and time, a lot of yeses and nos, more nos than yeses. And you have to prove yourself. At least once with this deal done, they can instantly just get to work and deliver and execute and try and scale that sports property. So there's a fair bit to like in this. Like there's probably not a lot of money in that initial wave, but they got a reliable partner they can really work with to make sure it works for all involved.
Well, interestingly, I spoke with someone, I guess that would fit in that challenger sport model that you were talking about, and they were saying it's actually never been easier negotiating rights with broadcasters and platforms like DAZN because essentially the way she described it was, is sports media is a beast. And you have to always be feeding the beast, and if you want people to justify their subscription cost, you have to have programming at all times. And even if it's not premium programming, you've got to be able to constantly have a reason that when people come onto the platform, there's some sort of live content. And, even though the PFL is not at the level of the UFC momentarily, or some of the fights that DAZN also has with, Anthony Joshua and stuff like that, you still need to, I guess, have that programming that's consistently on all the time so people feel like they're getting their money's worth. So I do think it is interesting. And there's, as you say, there is a space for DAZN with these particular types of deals.
For sure. It just depends also what you want to return, right? So how much are you willing to accept? How much are you willing to pay? And there's always this tension in business, right? No matter what you've got to offer, the supply and demand economics will play a role here. As will PFL just take any deal just to get scale and then and not worry about it? Will they need to be putting money on the table? Sometimes we talked about the live golf scenario where some might be having to pay to get some airtime to get exposure and increase their reach. I mean, PFL's in a space where there's some competition. You talk about UFC, you talk about the One Championship. They're trying to grow and they've got all good aspirations to take over the world and be the dominant force. So, the PFL has raised, I think, something like $200 million in capital funding to grow, so that they're well backed. But it's a competitive space, which means everyone has to spend a lot more money to get where they need to get to. So therefore, you also need to generate more revenue over the course of time. So it's an interesting mix, and it's going to be very, I guess, very just see what happens, particularly in this European market, because you've got one championship focused on Asia, you've got the US market dominated by UFC, PFL's got a place there, one championship's trying to grow there. Europe, um, you know, they one championship. I'm not sure about their influence and events they have over here, but the UFC does run some things periodically. So there is a gap and opportunity here for them to do something. It's just a matter of how ready the market is for it, I guess.
Yeah, I'd agree Champions League is bold, but nonetheless, I welcome them into the market, and hopefully, like I said, just more things for me to watch on a Saturday. The last story we wanted to talk about, it brings us back to the NBA as well as with the WNBA, and a company we've managed to speak to before. We've had Bohan on from Buzzer, but basically the news is they've now extended that partnership that they've had with the NBA and the WNBA to basically act as a distributor for live streaming content. But basically, how they work is it's pay-per-view access into very key windows of the game. So you get your notification, hey, your favorite team, LeBron James and Los Angeles Lakers, they're down three with 3 minutes left in the game. Would you like to watch? And they sell it to you for $1. And I think I've also actually I don't know enough about it, but they've now apparently also introduced a redeemable credit system. So it's not necessarily all just strictly on cash, something I'd have to look more into. But Nick, do you think this is just good validation to say the technology and the experience with Buzzer is it is what it is, and more people need to be looking into this type of technology? Or what's sort of your take just from this deal getting extended?
Just out of interest, that redeemable credit one, is that similar to the recast model? Do you know much
So
about that one?
So I know exactly the recast model, and I'm a fan of it. I actually don't know enough about how Buzzer's system works with that, other than when you read the
That's fine.
press release, it talks about the credit system. But I imagine it's got to have some similarities.
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with recast, the model, if I understand correctly, Chris, is that you basically you can gain credits. You can buy credits, but you also can watch advertising to gain those credits to watch the content. So it's a nice way of removing some of the friction of making someone have to pay to watch, and maybe it's something around those lines, or there's other ways to get redeemable credits. But hopefully, we'll find out more and we'll share more with the audience once we get more detail. But look, it's good. It's really good to see that Buzzer has renewed their deal with those organizations. Love what they're trying to do. Love the technology and the idea and the initiative behind it. Great talking to Bo, who we've had on the podcast, and we had at our event in OTT USA in March. There's a lot to like about what they do. I personally, again, I haven't dug into the detail enough, but I've always felt like what they're trying to do feels like it would be better placed as like a white label offering to provide to organizations who are running their own platform. I mean, everyone wants to be the aggregator, the home for this sort of stuff, but it just feels like that is a tough proposition to just scale at the scale that they would probably need to do. And I do think they even had some challenges with maybe downsizing, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong with that one, but I think they did have to downsize their headcount a little bit at the end of or beginning of this year or midway through this year, I think. Sorry, I'm getting lost at what time of the year it is. But my point is, look, lots to like about Buzzer. We've been following him for a couple of years now. Some big organizations have got involved, and they are trying to change the way people access these sorts of content. And I'm all for it. So we need to offer, more than just the traditional subscription model. Um, and they are layering that with some great intelligence and insights and personalization, which younger audiences are all craving, and every broadcast is trying to do. So a lot to like, and I really hope Buzzer as a platform and product do succeed because they're trying to do something really exciting. I just wonder personally whether it's the right model, but hey, it's not my call, and it's not my place. I don't know enough about the devil's always in the detail, right? But it's good to see that the WNBA and the NBA have got involved once again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things, whether or not you agree with the statement that Gen Z and younger don't have a long attention span, which I'd argue is not the case. But the whole point being is if they're not going to tune in for the entire game, that doesn't mean you shouldn't give up on trying to monetize them if you can get them for the last 2 minutes to say, hey, we're down to the wire here, sort of thing. So I think it's just a great way to further for people that are always trying to figure out how do I squeeze as much value out of my rights that I have because I've already licensed them off here, licensed them off here. You may be able to find a little extra pocket for some additional revenue by saying, hey, I want to be able to monetize this very specific set of rights that's only applicable in the last 2 minutes or whatever time it is. It's just a very nice model, as you say.
And a great way to get a taster of a sport before you commit to spending, what we talked about before, the NBA, the Clipper Vision was $200 a year for those in market rights. That's
Mhm.
not cheap for someone who's not necessarily bought in. Those products are great for a top tier fan, but if I'm not a Clippers fan, I'm never going to pay that. Whereas if you can offer me these sort of micro payments and make sure that the experience is super frictionless, then I might consider dipping my toe in every now and again because you've got something exciting happening, whether it's a big event, whether it's a big matchup, or a game's coming down to the wire. We obviously saw, the NBA's done something differently, but similar sort of vein with, I think, Turner or Warner Media around those last few minutes, charging microtransactions. But that's gone quite quiet, I think, since they've done that. So maybe it's more difficult to change customer behavior and get people used to it. I think that's the hard thing is like you
Mhm.
might have the best idea in the world, but you still have to change customer behavior. And that is way harder than coming up with a great idea.
Old dogs, new tricks. I definitely have heard that before, Nick, right?
Absolutely. I can definitely attest to that.
Awesome. Well, as always, Nick, it's a pleasure to catch up. Like I said, there was a lot of news this week. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed that. Again, as always, feel free to tell us what we've got right, what we've got wrong. I know Nick's got an interview coming up next week for a bit of a deep dive, but like I said, hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode. Please do let us know if you've listened through, if you're going to be out there in Madrid, and we'd love to see you guys there. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, everyone.